Rebekah Roth here again. This time I want to talk to you about the hijackers. Believe it or not, more than a dozen of them are still alive. I had done an earlier video about the problems with the manifest on Flight 11. And the FBI originally claimed there were two Bukhari brothers. They'd actually said they rented a car and left it in Portland, Maine, and they'd found the paperwork for Adnan and Amir Bukhari. Well, they weren't brothers after all, and Amir was dead for a year, so I wonder how that worked. Then the other people that they claimed were there also showed up alive. So they quickly changed that story. Somewhere in that first 48 hours of our 9/11 story, the media changed. But here's the problem. They chose 4 other people that were also still alive, and they've never changed the government story. Those people still are alive. Now, I know that a Saudi government had threatened to sue the U.S. government for stealing their identity and using their names. A couple of them I know were professional pilots, commercial pilots. So bottom line is, no hijackers died on Flight 11 because no hijackers ever got on Flight 11. So if the real passenger manifest showed no Arab names, which they did, because employees immediately will print off a passenger list if there's an incident like that. Well, throughout my research, I managed to grab about 1 terabyte of Freedom of Information Act information, and buried inside that was a transcript I found so interesting. And I believe it was Betty Ong who was talking to a reservation agent who called in the security people. And she called back, or eventually said later on in her call that wasn't taped, that the hijackers were in seat 2A and B. Now she's only talking about 2. So the security personnel asked, wait a minute, she originally said the hijackers were in 9A and 9B. Is she changing her mind? How does this work? Well, I looked that up because I thought, well, she wouldn't make that mistake. No flight attendant would. And interestingly enough, 9A and B are both 2 Jewish men, but 9B was a highly trained assassin from a special forces group of soldiers called the Sayeret Matkal from Israel's special forces out of the Israeli Defense Forces. So I did have to look, and I will do a video about his story. Over on Flight 175, that was United, the second plane to leave, here's an interesting tidbit. 3 of the 5 are reportedly still alive. So again, no hijackers. 5 of those people, 5 of those, quote, hijackers, connect to the same Jewish realtor in Delray Beach, Florida. Now that's interesting. Over, if you look now at Flight 77, that was the 757 that supposedly hit the Pentagon, but we know because of the phone calls that it didn't. 3 of the 5 hijackers, quote, quote, the accused hijackers, are connected to the CIA, the FBI, or some other intelligence agency, and 1 of them connects to the same Jewish realtor or Delray Beach, Florida. The first 2 supposed hijackers that came to the United States came here in January of the year 2000, almost 20 months before 9/11. Khalid al-Madar and Nawaf al-Hazmi arrived at LAX in January 2000. They were met immediately. Now, there's lots of stories about where they got picked up by this guy, but by a guy named Omar Bayoumi, who is a suspected intel operative. The problem is Saudi Arabia says he's not our guy. CIA doesn't say anything, neither does Mossad. He could have been either or all 3. Later on, however, he introduced these 2 to an FBI informant in Southern California, where they actually lived with him. They were living with an FBI informant. That's what I'm telling you, there's connections here. In June, just 6 months later, Khalid left and flew back to Yemen, where he had a wife who was just about ready to deliver a baby. And so he went home, and of course he had phone calls that would have been tapped by the NSA, but they can't find them. Another interesting character, Hani Hanjour, he was already known by the FBI, and I'm going to do a whole video on this guy. Very interesting American citizen named Akai Collins. He wrote a book called My Jihad. And Akai Collins had left the Al-Qaeda and became an FBI and CIA asset informant since 1996 until 1999. He had met Hanny Hanger. The FBI said, we know him. He's not a threat to anyone. Now, moving along to Flight 93, 3 of the 4 supposed hijackers are definitely still alive, and 3 of the 4 of the supposed hijackers all connect to that same Jewish realtor down at Delray Beach, Florida. So what do we have? We have 9 at least. These are just ones I found. At least 9 hijackers connect to one Jewish realtor at Delray Beach, Florida. At least 13 of them are still alive, and at least 3 of them have fake ID or the wrong photos in their passports. I don't know how they found that out, but that's what they claim. 6 of them, at least, that I have found. Now, come on, I'm a retired flight attendant. I'm not a snooper. But they connect to an intelligence agency somewhere along the line. Now, let me just tell you that what happens in the airline business. Ticket agents immediately will print out a passenger manifest. And why would we do that? Well, we would do that because if our friends, our family are flying around on a pass, well, their names would be on the passenger manifest. And here, lo and behold, they found no Arab names were on the passenger manifest. So we know the FBI faked all the names. We know that more than half of them are still alive. And so what happens with the ticket agents print these things out, and they took them home with them. Problem is, their story didn't match with the government story that popped up in the coming days, so they didn't know what to do with that information. That's all they found me. Well, I found it very odd that about half of the accused hijackers found the same Jewish realtor. Now, we were told that these guys were radical, fundamental Muslims, and we've been told by our media for years that Muslims hate Jews, and the more radical and fundamental they are, the more they hate Jews. Yet these super radical terrorist Muslim suicide pilots managed to not just find the same Jewish realtor in Delray Beach, Florida, but they chose to work with her. And they did. And so these are the things I found just odd with the story. But while researching 9/11, it wasn't really until I started looking and I was reading about the anthrax, and I found no FBI interview 302 on this realtor. And I thought, well, that's weird. But then I also found all these headlines where she just claimed she only connected to 2, but actually she connects to either 5 or 6. She gave these names to the media that interviewed her. But after the anthrax attack, because of the connection to her husband's work from one of the people that died, I found this in the book called, I believe the title was Anthrax, might have been Anthrax Attack, but it's Leonard Cole who wrote this, and he writes in there the story that she told him that at 10:15 on the night of 9/11, she was called by the FBI and brought to her office and did an interview. They would have a 302. Now, this could be one of the things that's still classified. The realtor's story is very strange, I have to say. And I'll do a whole video on that story because it's so crazy. All of the headlines, again, she only said 2, but they were different names each time I read through them. And then I started taking notes and started paying attention. And I'm still asking, why would the FBI not have a 302 available for us researchers to read? And then I found several newspaper articles, and every one of them came out after that first anthrax death because he was working at her husband's job. And I just found it very interesting that the realtor connects to so many of these guys, and yet we're told that these guys were radical Muslims. They hate Jews. Well, that's what the media tells us anyway. They didn't say anything like that, but that's the story. And So while I started reading through all these books, I had to learn how the spy agencies work. I started reading about espionage, and in particular in the book by Gordon Thomas called Gideon's Spies, I learned that the term sayanim, which is actually a plural term for sayan, S-A-Y-A-N. And sayanim means actually a volunteer Jewish helper. A volunteer Jewish helper who lives, keynote, outside of Israel. Well, that would be the Jewish realtor living in Florida, I thought to myself. So in this case, we have the Jewish realtor, and she was finding them temporary housing. And in the book, it explains that they might find a sayanim, might be a realtor, car rental, and they might find a rental car or temporary housing okay, for Mossad agents or assassins for the Israel Mossad. So I thought, well, is it possible, could it possibly be that Jewish woman, that all of these, she connects to at least 9 that I've found in print. Could she possibly be a sayan? Could she be a helper for the Mossad agents? Because Mohammed Atta's parents said he was working for the Mossad. Ziad Jarrah had 2 relatives that were arrested years later for being Mossad agents. So I think this is a question that should be asked. I think we should look into this and ask, are there connections to both the Israeli Mossad and the CIA everywhere we look in this story? Yeah, there are. Everywhere throughout the 9/11 story, there's a connection to some intelligence agency. Now, let me just give you an example. Not just CIA, Mossad, MI5, MI6, French intelligence, German intelligence. It's a lot. But let me just remind you, she connects to 9 of the 19. At least 13 of them are still alive. 3 of them had bad passports. This one Jewish realtor, is it possible? We have to look at the connections. And we have to ask the question that is burning now. Was 9/11 a real terrorist attack? Or was it an intelligence operation? We just have to look at all the connections. It's a shocker.